Hello and welcome to Podcasting, Why, How To and Pros and Cons. This is going to be an interactive session aimed at helping you work out whether you'd like to podcast or not, with some suggestions on how to get going. It's going to be an over-the-shoulder style, so I'll be sharing my screen with you and it'll include lots of practical plans. I'm going to answer frequently asked questions. Why should you podcast? What formats and structure should you use? How will you record it? What about branding and building community? And finally, pros and cons. If you've got any questions at all as we go through the lesson, please send them over and I'll try and answer them at the end of the video. So I'm Philippa, producer of the Poetry Pause podcast. Hello and welcome to the Poetry Pause, a podcast on poems from a cowshed in West Wales. We are quite crazy for poetry, where we aim to share poetry love through chat. And I'm also a writer and psychologist, and I teach on Udemy. I've a writing course there. In the past, I've worked as a journalist and I've written and presented a bit on radio and TV on psychological matters, usually because I'm a psychologist. So why podcast and what is your mission? In recent months, podcasting has become more and more popular as lockdown encourages us to experiment with different ways of getting our messages out. So this chart I'm going to show you now was published on July the 2nd, so you can see the growth in the UK. I'll just share my screen with you now. So we can see here that between 2019 and 2020, growth in the UK has gone from about 21-22% to closer to 24%. And I think the population of the UK is about 66-67 million. So that's about 15 million people. They've analysed 14,000 adults. So it's on the way up. Next question to ask ourselves is, what do we know about people who listen to podcasts? So these statistics are from Podcast Insights. They show us, this is US statistics, so about half the population have listened to a podcast. Podcast listeners are loyal, affluent and educated. And if we look at musicumph.com, so there are more than 850,000 active podcasts. These are the most popular genres. So pretty much everything I think fits into society and culture, or an awful lot of things. Perhaps you're doing health or business. Don't know where you would fit. Be good to hear. The demographics tend to be 25 to 54, most popular with. And education and income. So generally speaking, podcast listeners are pretty well educated and they're also well heeled. And this is the gender split and smartphone usage. We also know that from podcast listeners that they are more active generally than other people on social media, and about half of them listen at home. So we'll think more about this, what this means to you, very soon. A podcast can help you get your voice heard, literally, and get your message out quite cheaply. You can combine unusual interests in a podcast. So here are some podcasts which demonstrate this. These are ones that I like. This is my favourite murder. And this is an extremely popular podcast in research of who made what money in the US from podcasting last year. These two clever podcasters earned about $15 million. You know, they've generated a whole ecosystem to make their podcast successful. Next, we're going to look at Brown Girls Do It Too, which won the British Podcast Awards a couple of weeks ago. So here you can see Rubina and Poppy. You can hear a little bit of the podcast here.
Hi guys, welcome to the last episode in the series of Brown Girls Do It Too. Ow! That was more of a whoop than a boo.
So this is a podcast on a subject that people were not talking about, and it's great fun. And you can combine unusual people or interests in a podcast. So I'm a big fan of Reese Witherspoon. I love all the TV stuff that she does. I love her book club. And I also like Brené Brown. And lo and behold, I discovered that Brené, Reese and Kerry Washington, who stars in Little Fires Everywhere, are all in a podcast. I really enjoyed listening to that. So podcasting is characterised by being both intimate and informal. And often a podcast is evergreen content that's not time-bound, will stand the test of time and have search engine value for you, probably because of that. So before we go any further, I'd like you to think about what would your mission be in making a podcast. So this is your why. Why are you making the podcast? And you may want to do several of these things. So here are some ideas. Do you want to teach people, entertain people, make people laugh, help people through challenges, engage them about news or culture, show them new perspectives, a new take on things? So identifying your mission is really important because it will steer your content. It'll always be there to help you decide what should or shouldn't go into your podcast, and it'll motivate you. It's the reason you're doing it. I don't want to sound all kind of hippy-dippy now, but loving your subject is quite important in podcasting. It's love that will keep you going through the initial hurdles and keep you doing it, podcasting. So we're gliding now into how to podcast, and we need to think about who you're creating your podcast for. So our Poetry Pause podcast is for poetry lovers, people who already know they like the stuff and may want to write better poetry themselves. Now, I've two friends who are great podcast fans, both in their 30s, so they're quite a bit younger than me. Meg is a gardener and Billy is a hairdresser. And they both make, I think, great podcasters. So I'm going to take you through some ideas for them that may be useful for you. So Meg does very sustainable, environmentally friendly gardening, specialising in very natural gardens. So she might choose to podcast for other gardeners who want to follow her style of gardening, or armchair garden enthusiasts who want to be as green as possible, or even teachers who are getting kids doing green gardening. So she's got a choice there of target folk for her audience. Now, Billy might do a hairdressing podcast for other hairdressers on hairdressing dilemmas. What do you do when your client ruins your handiwork? Or for people who want to do their own hair at home, or maybe a podcast on bridal hair, for instance. There's various options for her to choose for her audience. So your interest as a podcaster will be important, but you can also check out what other podcasts exist by going to this website called Podfollowcom and applying it to your subject and seeing what else is about. So if we tap in hairdressing here, we get the following results. If we tap in gardening, we get these results. You can also look at Apple, Spotify, or Google your subject followed by podcast when you search. And because of the informal and intimate nature of podcasting, an exercise where you look at your ideal listener can be really helpful. What I like to suggest to would-be podcasters is that you think about a day in the media life of your ideal listener. What media does she consume throughout the day? And when does your podcast win over something she may watch on TV or look at elsewhere on the web or listen to on the radio? So, for instance, Meg, with her sustainable gardening, may think of fellow gardeners who will listen in the way that she does while working, especially late morning when lunch is looming and you want an extra bit of motivation. Billy, with hairdressers as an audience, may aim for the time between finishing work and collapsing on the sofa when you're in the kitchen doing supper and maybe you have a sip or two of wine. So early evening. The clearer the picture you've got of your ideal listener and what she's up to, the better. If you want to take this little exercise further, then you can ask yourself, what other media does she consume during the day? Does she read a paper, physical or digital? What websites does she regularly visit? Is she an ITV or BBC girl? What radio stations would she like? And then, of course, there's thinking about digital interests and whether your ideal listener is in any particular online groups. Poetry fans, for instance, often go on big free poetry MOOCs, online courses run by universities, and they often like gardening, nature, and The Guardian. So, what format and structure will your podcast take? Once you've got your podcast mission and who it's for, you'll need to decide on the type of podcast. So here are some different types of podcasts, and time, costs and technical skills will come into your choice here. So I'll just share my screen on this now. So here are some formats. There's a monologue, where you are on your own basically. An interview, which is very popular, where you chat to other people. They may be with you, they may be not. A narrative, where you tell a story. Multi-host, where a couple of you interview other people and chat. Round the table, which is a discussion, which is what we do in our podcast. And a documentary, which is more like a radio show, really, where you drop in different bits of footage and different pieces of media. Really here what you need to do is picture yourself podcasting and ask yourself, which of these can you see yourself doing? Obviously, if you're going to do documentary, there may be quite a lot of editing and technical work required. So for our green gardening podcast, Meg might decide she's going to do straight interviews with people, or she may visit other people's gardens and ask them to chat about greener gardens. She might even decide she'd like to do an Ask Me Anything podcast where people send in questions and she replies to them. And Billy, our hairdresser, could do something similar, but she might decide to record in the salon after it's closed, or to have a couple of hairdresser friends round with a bottle of wine to discuss hairdressing disasters and other issues. So have a look at these formats and find one or two that might work for you. This is your most important decision, really, because it determines what you'll do in your podcast. So, to sum up for now where we're at, we've thought about your mission in your podcast, who you will podcast for, and the format your podcast might take. All of these you may want to research further, and you may find it useful through Podfollow to find other podcasters in your subject matter and to compare and contrast them based on podcast mission, what is it they seem to want to be doing, for who do they seem to be targeting, and what is their format. And this could help you find gaps in podcast provision that you might be able to fill. We're being quite scientific about this, but I think it's the most efficient way, really, of sorting out whether your podcast idea is a viable one. So I hope you find it helpful. Next, what will the action be? So you'll need to decide on structure within your format, what happens within each episode. This is what you're most likely to be scripting rather than actual words that you will repeat verbatim. We found out on the podcast that I produce that if we overscript and include too many things that we want to say in the podcast starts to sound very stilted and formal. It doesn't work really. It kind of sounds like somebody sitting an exam and trying to, get everything in the right order. So your script really is just the action, what happens, and any key questions and themes you might want to include. So something like this. I'll show you a bit of my script here. You can see it's very informal. So your idea is cooking and you need to work out how to record it. Now, people worry an awful lot about the technical side of podcasting. And the good news is that sound engineers are the most amazingly helpful people, offering loads of free advice online. The bad news is, to be a good sound engineer, you have to love detail. And it's easy to drown in a morass of really great advice and feel swamped. So the most useful resource I found, and I can't recommend it too highly, is a fantastic Facebook group set up by a woman pioneer, really, in podcasting, Helen Zaltman. And it's called the Podcasters Support Group. And there are loads of helpful resources there you can search for. The membership are incredibly helpful. It's just great. So your budget's going to determine your equipment and whether you're going to farm out some of the tasks, like editing your podcast. We do everything DIY on ours and researched a lot before buying equipment. You can do a lot with your environment through blankets, screens. You want to make it the opposite of a typical bathroom, which is a lot of hard reflective surfaces for the sound to bounce off. So the softer your room, the better. And this is actually one of the most important determinants on how good your podcast is going to sound. Here's a list of the basics. Now, the fun stuff. How will you brand it? At this stage, then, you can start to think about branding. Can you sum up the idea neatly so people immediately understand it? And what will your podcast be called? What will the artwork be like? And how will people know about it? Your podcast branding needs a kind of immediacy so that people know straight away whether it's for them or not. While I'm talking about branding, I want to mention money. Podcasting is not a route to get rich quick unless you are incredibly special and lucky. But your branding and following may make your podcast an attractive proposition for an advertiser or a sponsor. Have a look at Megaphone FM and Anchor FM. You may want to investigate affiliate possibilities for your podcast website. Maybe you want to be an Amazon affiliate. That's because there's stuff that can be sold that relates to your podcast. Some podcasters, particularly a couple of legal and crime ones, have gone to Patreon and Kickstarter where they've crowdfunded support. Again, if you're going to do that, you'd have to be pretty sure those podcasts were going to come regularly and reliably, I think. How will you build your community? So getting your podcast to people feels much more like community building and networking than it does aggressive marketing. We know our audience is likely to be interested in our subject and probably share our enthusiasm as they've been bothered to download our podcast. So you've got people who are kind of closer in to the subject. There may be less of them, but they are, fans in a way already. So one thing that makes the detail worth attending to is the scope for creativity in your social media for your podcast. So you can publish sound, text, or video excerpts. And there's software like Headliner and Wave, which will help you convert your podcast quickly into little bits of video or audiogram where you see a sound wave. So before we finish, and hopefully have a bit of chat, I'm going to finish on what I think are some of the pros and cons. So pros, it opens up opportunities. It gives you kind of broadsheet possibility and credibility, I think. There's a bit of weight in establishing and creating a podcast. It refreshes your subject. It can open up creative possibilities for you and your fans that you're podcasting with. It can widen your network and your learnings. If podcasters seek out guest opportunities on other people's podcasts and extend their networks mutually that way. So it's very, very networked. And podcasting is a relatively new form of digital. So there are gaps in provision. I know just researching for this workshop, I have found some gaps, big gaps in provision where I think people could be podcasting. So your subject may well lend itself to that. Now the cons, it's what I would call deep reach rather than wide reach. You're unlikely to go viral with a podcast because it's more about loyalty and long-term interest in the subject. And you are much more likely to get a smaller bunch of very engaged people than a big bunch of less engaged people. It is time-consuming initially, I think, and I certainly had to upskill. I am a bit of a nerd, and I do like software, and I do like editing, confession. So I quite enjoyed all that, but not everybody does, in which case you might want to farm it out. You can use sites like Fiverr. I haven't, but you can. And finally, your obvious community may be low on podcast fans, in which case it may not be the best media for you unless you want to persuade people to have to listen to podcasts as a new habit, as well as choosing your podcast. Final pro, podcasters are above all else chatty enthusiasts, and there's a huge amount of help available. I've put a list together of some of my favourite links. And if you'd like the transcript of this session and the links, I've made a Podcasting for Beginners guide, which you can download from the link that goes with this session. Otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed this. Please send your questions over. Good luck on your podcasting journey. Have fun. And remember, above all else, it's a way of having a great chat.